Welcome to our final session of our Writers Chat. This is the last of our 8-week series, and it's a pleasure to have Dr. Matt Mercuri here with us today. He helped us kick off our first session back in July, and he'll help wrap it up today with Don't Stop Believing, Dealing with Rejections and Resilience. Dr. Matt Mercuri is currently an assistant professor in the Division of Emergency Medicine at McMaster University and at the Institute of Health Policy, Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. In 2018, he was named editor-in-chief for the Journal of Evaluation in Clinical Practice, and his research interests are focused on medical epistemology, variations in medical practice, and issues around radiation exposure from diagnostic imaging. So welcome, Matt. Pleasure, as I said, to have you back with us again. And I'm going to turn it over to you to share your insights and thoughts around rejections and resilience.
Thank you. And thank you for having me back. Rejection is something I know well. Don't let the titles and the positions fool you. Everybody writes papers and they all get rejected. It's very rare that you get a paper that you write that's accepted right away. I've had it happen one time in my entire career that an editor read a paper and said, "This is great, no changes, let's move forward." What's more typical is, 4 or 5 journals say no, and then someone finally says yes. That's not unique to scholars who are just starting out. Nobel Prize winners will tell you stories about how their Nobel Prize papers got rejected 5 times before they got published. So rejection is normal. The question is, what do you do with that rejection? There's a tendency to blame everybody else. And then there's a tendency to say, well, maybe I'm not very good at this. Well, it's a little bit of both and neither at the same time. So let's step back for a second and think about what is the purpose of a peer review. If a peer review is done well or correctly, and this is kind of, I guess, potentially my own position, but I know Teresa shares it. Peer review is supposed to help you, right? Peer review is not supposed to show you. It's not a gatekeeper of good knowledge. Things are not somehow accepted ideas or true because they get through peer review, right? Something I find really interesting because a lot of media right now is saying, these studies on COVID, but they're not peer reviewed, therefore they're not true. It's like, well, that's not how it works. It doesn't become true because it becomes peer reviewed, right? Because you can have terrible peer review. The purpose of peer review is to help you identify issues in your paper that can be improved, plain and simple. It can come across as negative. It can come across as unhelpful. But the goal to all peer review as a receiver of it is to look for the information in the response that helps you improve. And that's how you should take it. Don't think of it as a slight on you or your work or anything you've done. Just think of it as this person is legitimately trying to help me. Now, one of the biggest problems I think people have is there's a tendency to look at it and say, well, they didn't understand what I said. Well, you can say that. I'm going to dismiss this feedback because they didn't understand me. Or you can turn that around and say, that's a problem with my paper. I need to improve that. Right? The issue is a lack of as poor communication. And that's something that's my responsibility as an author and something that I can control. Right? So what I find as an editor is the vast majority of criticisms of decent papers or better is that they just weren't communicated very well. So that is the most important point, I think, about peer review. The second thing is sometimes there are fatal flaws, right? And if there are fatal flaws, then you got to think about what you're going to do. It's okay to have a paper not get published. That's fine too. I know you put a lot of work into something and you say, I've done this. I should get something out of it. Well, what you get out of it is you get someone pointing out to you that maybe your work needs more improvements than you think. So this is an opportunity for the community to give you advice on how to move your program forward. Right. And then there's a third kind of advice that's given in peer review or in the rejection that can be very frustrating. It's this is an interesting paper, but you know what they should have done. Right. And sometimes that's helpful and sometimes that's not helpful. And you just got to learn how to pick the criticisms that are useful to you and look at the criticisms that you say, this is not an area I'm going to get into. Okay. So that's the kinds of rejection you get. The next thing is, what do you do when you get, I'm not going to say rejection, you get somewhere in between. The paper is got criticism, but it isn't outright rejected. The question is, how do you respond to that? The first thing you don't do is email the editor and tell the editor that the editor's an idiot, because that doesn't work. I can assure you that does not work. I get that email probably once a week, and it's always the same story. It's always me writing them back saying, how do you think this is going to work for you? How do you think this is going to turn out? I want you to reflect on the letter you just sent me and ask yourself if you think that this strategy is going to be helpful to you. If you're telling me my rejection is stupid, you've just insulted my judgment. And I have all the power, right? I don't have to publish your work. So don't do that. That's not helpful. It doesn't help. It's not going to help you advance your work. It's only going to cause more friction, and it only can be negative for you. So as much as you want to do that, don't do that. My best advice when you get a review back that a rejection or a revision or something that you don't like, my best advice is to put it away for a day or two and then read it again. And then put it away for another day and then maybe read it again, right? Let yourself think about the things that set in, because this is the general process which I went through, especially when I was starting out. Those guys are idiots. Followed by, I took another look at it, and these problems don't seem too difficult to fix. Followed by, this paper is actually much better now that I got this advice. And that was a typical, and now I'm hoping to just get right to stage 3 as quickly as I possibly can, right?
Because I call it the academic grief cycle, because you're mourning, you're mourning your perfect paper. You're basically saying, my perfect paper is not perfect, and it could have been better. And that's hard sometimes when you've worked so hard on something.
Yeah, I mean, we're not stupid, right? I mean, if we're in a position where we can write papers, it's probably because we're educated. So we write something, and if we think it's not the best it can possibly be, why do we send it into a journal, right? So it's always going to be shocking when someone comes back. Now, if they come back with criticisms that you anticipated, you have to ask yourself a question: why didn't you fix them, ahead of time? So that's on you, right? But you should feel a sense of rejection when you get criticisms of your paper, because, like I said, you write that paper saying, this is good, this is communicated well, this is why it's ready to send for publication. So it's going to be shocking that someone didn't understand you. There are ways you can avoid that. You can, shop it around to some of your friends, people who haven't read the paper yet, who aren't too close to it, and see what they say. That might be helpful to avoid the rejection, but we're not talking about that part today. I'm happy to talk about that. But the issue is, rejection is normal. What do you do when you get it? And the answer is, try to learn from it, right? You're all adults. You're all successful people. It's not a criticism of you, right? And we just have to remind ourselves of that.
And lately, I would say that every journal has been flooded by more papers. And so, of course, they have the same number of pages. And so there's a pressure for the editors to maybe pick a little bit harder, be a little choosier. Things that maybe pre-COVID, when there wasn't as much volume, something might have gone up for review is getting rejected. Something that's been reviewed that might have been revised and resubmit is being rejected. And everything is a slightly harder right now since the advent of the pandemic. I think more people are submitting things, but then I think there's also just more science being done because people aren't traveling, people aren't doing other things right now. And that's changed the nature of peer review in terms of where it has driven some of the decision-making process, I think.
Yeah, and to follow on that, it's not just that people are doing more. It turns out that everyone right now is doing the same thing. And I mean, I have had probably 50 papers this year submitted to my journal that all say they're all talking about physician burnout, right? Physician burnout during pandemic. Okay, yeah, we get it, right? I read this paper last week and the week before and the week before that and the week before that. My readers don't want to read this paper again and again and again and again and again and again. Your study is really good, but if you submitted it, 32 weeks ago, it probably would have gone to peer review. right? So it's not necessarily a knock on the work that you're doing or the importance of the topic. It's also that, you want to give your readership something to read, and you don't want to send them things that they've already read. And again, not to suggest that work isn't important, but everybody had the same idea, right? Everybody's doing the physician burnout study right now. Everybody's doing the study on vaccine hesitancy. Everybody's doing the study on we had to change our process at our hospital because of whatever. Everyone's doing these studies. I read them again and again and again. So what do you do with that? What do you do with that rejection, right? There's nothing wrong with the paper. Editor's just not interested, right? And that one's a little bit harder. I mean, again, I will argue that every paper has a home. Sometimes every paper has a home in terms of where you're willing to put it and how much you're willing to spend. But there's nothing wrong with walking away from a paper completely and just taking it as a learning opportunity. I did a master's degree in kinesiology. I worked on my thesis for that degree. I submitted the paper to a journal. The journal said, no, we don't like it as a full-length paper. Can you make it a research note? I reduced it to a research note, sent it back, and then the two reviewers said, there's not enough information in a research note, right? And then I sent it to the other biomechanics journal, and they said, no, we're not interested. And then I had to abandon it, right? That information is still available through my thesis on McMaster University's libraries. So it's not like the information's not available to a scientist who cares, but I had to make the decision, right? This is something that isn't publishable, and I need to move on with my life. And that's okay too, right? It's not saying that the work is not useful. It's saying that the work doesn't really have a home, and the best it's going to be is a thesis, and that's okay. So these are kind of the general issues. I mean, I think a lot of the concerns around rejection are driven by ourselves, our egos, are the tension between what we think the expectations of us by our employers, right? I need to get another paper because my boss is going to wonder what I'm doing. Well, for the clinicians in the group, probably not as much of a concern as you think it is. For the scientists in the group, you'll have other ideas. It's okay, right? And that's a hard one. We all suffer that one. I still haven't come to terms with it, so I'm not going to give you any advice on that. But I've said a lot. So Alana, Teresa, I wonder if you want to jump in and say anything.
These are great ideas and great perspectives and how we look at the feedback that we get. And this builds on when Kevin Eva was talking to us last week about handling revisions more at the internal stage of the development of your paper. And, we all feel probably so closely attached to the work that we do that I think it's hard sometimes to separate the feedback that's given as the feedback on the paper versus feedback that's given to you personally. And so I think about the resilience piece. For many, it might be difficult to kind of keep bringing yourself back to try again. Any thoughts on, how do you, if you have multiple rejections, maybe it's on different papers, but how do you kind of build that resilience?
Well, we work in a deeply negative and toxic career, right? No one reads your paper and says, that's a great paper. Everyone reads your paper and says, I enjoyed this is the best they'll say, I enjoyed your paper, but, right? So how do you build that resilience? I had I guess, colleague now who once said to me, you either develop a really thick skin or a huge ego. I don't think either of those are actually, they don't make me comfortable. I don't want to develop a huge ego, and I don't have a thick skin. I'm not going to I'm 45 years old in 2 months. I'm not going to develop a thick skin all of a sudden, right? But how do you build resilience? So some of the things you can do is just look back on the fact that, it's, what did you learn, right? So is this about impressing other people, or is this about wanting to know for myself, right? So you think about what was the purpose of what I was trying to do here. And if your purpose is, I just want to be published, then my advice is find a big research team and just tack your name onto whatever they're doing and just do some grunt work for them. Because then you'll get your work published all the time. But I don't think that that's people's goal, right? I think the goal is I have ideas, right? I have ideas and I want to contribute those ideas and I want to be part of what's going on. So just keep reminding yourself what your goals are here, what it is you're actually trying to accomplish, and really focus on those more personal goals, not the professional goals, right? I think that helps. I'm lucky. I'm married to somebody who every day says, yes, Matt, but remember, you've already published lots of papers. This is not you're not here to like impress people. You're not here to get a Twitter following. You're not here to get citations. You're not here to get likes. That's not your goal. And sometimes it's just nice to hear that reminder, right? Well, why did I get into this in the first place? And so I think for building resilience, it's good to have a group. It's good to have a community. It's good to just have people to bounce those ideas off of when you get a rejection, to have them say things to you like, not like you're the greatest, they're all stupid, although sometimes that helps, right? For them to say, well, let's look at those comments together and see if there's anything we can do to help out, right? See if there's any how we can move forward together, right? It's a team, it's a community. Those are the strategies I use. Teresa knows, she gets a lot of phone calls. Not usually about rejection of papers, but mostly about the same kinds of things, right? Like it's, we all do it.
And I think the community is important, right? That's a big part of what it is that the community around you helps you support and be resilient. Wellness doesn't happen in a vacuum, and recovering from the slings and arrows of peer review or the hardships of being on the front line, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so we need to think about how we support each other in finding that resilience again. And it's not always simple, right? Sometimes it is letting someone going through their stages of grief around their paper and just being there to reflect and listen and take some of it. Sometimes it's knowing that you can't take any more of that because you've just had 5 papers rejected and that person's complaining about a revise and resubmit and you're just not in the mood, right? And so we have to be honest with ourselves, but we have to acknowledge that we have emotions around this stuff. So it's not always clear cut.
And I think that's a great point, Teresa. I mean, I'm looking at my own personal experience right now. I mean, like most people on this call, I'm sure we're all a little burnt out, right? The strategies that we used to have available to us to get breaks are not available to us anymore, right? You can't go on vacation. You can have a staycation, but that just means you're probably sitting in front of your computer a little bit less, but you're still probably working. And this idea, it's like if you have a couple of rejections in a row, so maybe sometimes it's just time to take a little bit of a break. Right? You don't need to be publishing every single day. And because if you start getting yourself into that mindset, then rejections become so much more meaningful to you. And that's no good, right? We don't want that. We don't want, I'm no good at this, I should And that can happen if you're just constantly trying to like fight the uphill battle with something. Maybe sometimes it's okay to just say, you know what, I've had a couple of rejections. I'm going to put this one aside for a little bit. In fact, I'm going to put everything aside for a little bit. I'm going to concentrate on something else. One thing that I find really useful when I get into that, no one's interested in this topic that I'm dealing with, or maybe I've done as much as I possibly can with it. Now I'm finding that more papers on the same topic are starting to become rejected because people are like, well, I don't see how this is advancing the conversation anymore. Just stop and read. Just give it all up for a while and just read and read and read and read and read. And it's funny because this actually goes back to our first session in terms of how to write. A family member of my wife's, who's an author, I said, what do you do when you get a writer's block? And she says, well, I read good work, right? I read good work. And then it's just, you start to understand a little bit about what good work looks like again. And that helps. And keep in mind that good work that you're reading, the draft that you're reading is almost never what was submitted. Almost never. So you just have to remind yourself as well that rejection is something that everybody, even the Nobel Prize winners, deal with constantly. And the final paper is never the paper that they wrote. That was never their first draft. So you're not unique. I think that helps as well to understand that I'm not special, or my rejections are not important rejections or a slight on me. It's just the field. It's a hard job. If it wasn't a hard job, everybody's ideas would be in peer-reviewed published journals all the time.
I think those are important things to keep in mind, that, what we see as being published has gone through its own revisions, right? We're seeing the final products at that stage. Another thing that comes to mind when I think about the sort of the rejections and the resilience piece of it is that sometimes we focus so much on the negative, or what we interpret as the negative feedback of where we need to make our revisions, that we sort of gloss over or miss the positive remarks that have been made about the paper. And so, balancing what you're reading and taking in, and having that positive, and the areas for constructive criticism at the same time, I think can really help with the resilience piece as well.
And on the note of the paper you see is not the final paper, I don't know if anyone has ever seen this, because it tends not to happen. But accidentally, I had a journal one time send back the proofs, but they sent it back with the original Microsoft Word tracker changes not changed yet. So this was the copy edit, okay? And the person who did the editing changed every single sentence in my entire paper. There was a red mark on every single sentence in my entire paper. Now, I am a decent writer, okay? That was really, really humbling. When I looked at that, I was just like, wow, I'm not as good a writer as I thought I was. Every single sentence had red. And then I wrote her. I wrote the person who did it. I said, look, is this normal? And she said, yep, this is normal. So, we don't see that. We don't see that when we read the final paper.
Yeah, there's always the hidden parts, the copy editing, the behind the scenes conversation. There's sometimes sidebars that happen with the editor and the author to try to sort things out. And we don't see that. We just see, a pre-press, and then we see a slightly different version, and that's all laid out properly in the journal. And it's like all that behind the scenes stuff. It actually takes quite a bit of work, and we sometimes don't acknowledge that part of the process is what gets us further down the mark. So,
yeah, I one time I submitted a paper to the American Journal of Cardiology, which is a high-level cardiology journal, and it was on radiation exposure from cardiac catheterizations and angiograms, and sent the paper along. And the editor, who's like 80-year-old cardiologist, he emails me back and says, do you have a fax machine? I said, I can find you a fax machine. He faxes me back my paper with like a Sharpie, just crossing out entire paragraphs. And he said, rewrite it this way, and I will publish the paper. That paper has been cited 110 times. So it's hard to argue with him. Right? But I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, I put those words in because those words were necessary. No one could possibly understand this paper without those words. That's why I used them. Turns out it didn't matter, right? So, yeah, some people are more experienced and have a lot of good things to tell you.
The hardest part is going to be the picking yourself up after a rejection. And so give yourself time to grieve, but give yourself time to process it, set it aside. The anger will fade with time. It's like a breakup. It's like you've kind of broken up with the journal. You need to cool off, and you're going to say something you regret if you email back. I'm sure Matt has many stories that he can't tell about unprofessional behavior because people don't do that cool off period, because they respond at the moment, reply all, and the editor's carbon copied on the rejection, et cetera, right? There's lots of people that sometimes aren't reading as closely as they should because they're in that fit of passion, right? As an emerge doc, I know what it's like. Sometimes when your emotions get the better of you, sometimes you say things you didn't mean. And sometimes you think things you don't really think, but your cortisol levels are up and your adrenaline is surging, and that's what's happening. And so I think that the best thing you can do for yourself is just take a deep breath, do some box breathing, and then walk away from a rejection. And I would say one other thing about resilience would be, if you are happy your paper got rejected because it means that you don't have to revise a paper, you're probably working too hard, because that is also kind of a bizarre, reaction, right? And so take stock of those moments where you're like, oh, thank goodness I don't have to do another revision. That might mean you're possibly working too hard and that you should chill out and take a break for a different reason, right? So those are a couple of things that I would kind of share as my insights.
That is a really good point, Teresa. I had that happen to me earlier this year, and I was just like, that's interesting. But getting to the whole, the people, hitting the reply all and saying the nasty things. I've had the very best. And I say the very best, I mean like people who if I say their names here, you would know who I'm talking about. Even if it's not in your field, you know who these people are. I've had the very best people in this in academic medicine complain to me about my decisions as an editor, right? The very best. I've had people write me nasty emails talking about the nastiness of the peer review when the peer review was not nasty at all. It was just not praising their great paper. And again, these are the highest tier people. And I've had several conversations with people about this. And one person it said to me very clearly, I think this is they said, why do they do this? And I said, well, because it probably has worked for them in the past. These people are just bullies. And I look at that a different way. Sure, that's another way you can deal with rejection. You can just become a bully. You can bully your way to the top. I would strongly advise against that because no one likes these people and the whole world is gunning for their failure. And you do not want your work to be about you because that's what it is now, right? This work is about them. You don't want to build a career that way because if you do, then you're just going to spend your entire career looking over your shoulder and constantly trying to find ways to deal with the social issues as opposed to actually dealing with the content of your work. We do this for content. That's the purpose of this job. It's not about you. You're just, a person who happens to be doing it. It's the ideas and and if you're an educator, then it's about the students. That's the goal of the research. It's about the students, right? If you're a clinician, you're doing clinical sciences, then it's about helping patients, right? It's not about helping you. So let's just remember that, right? When a paper is rejected because it's not, because it doesn't help patients, well, then you need to refocus your attention on how can I do this better so that I can do my job properly to help patients, right? As opposed to, oh no, I didn't get published. And I said, I think we all know that. We just all forget that in the moment.